All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for the Creative Vitality Summit. My name is David Holland. I'm the Director of Impact and Public Policy here at WestAF, the Western States Arts Federation, and one of the co-directors of the summit. I'm joined today by my friend Felipe, and I'm going to have Felipe, you introduce yourself to our audience.
Well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure for me to be here in this marvelous conference. My apologies to everybody. I'm in the middle of a congress in New York, so I had to do it from my phone. But I hope it's going to be an enjoyable session, and I would like to share some ideas. And for sure, I've been knowing David for a long time, so I hope you enjoy this friendly chat.
Awesome. So Felipe was recently the Minister of Culture in the Republic of Colombia, and now is at 360 Worldwide Entertainment. So a shift from the public to private sector. I'm just going to set that out, and then I'll pose my first question, which is related to what I just mentioned. Felipe, you've had an expansive career as a creative economy researcher and policymaker globally. How has your work been evolving recently?
Well, recently it's been very rewarding. You know, when you have the opportunity to see how concepts, ideas, and your long-term goals start becoming reality through laws, regulation, and the implementation of public measures, it's very rewarding. So we have witnessed in Colombia the application of a book I co-authored, several years ago, because you actually helped me with the translation to English, The Orange Economy and Infinite Opportunity. And in that book, we set down principles for policy making, and I'm happy to see that most of those principles are now enacted as law and being implemented as policy in Colombia.
Awesome. So what frameworks have you been using to develop the creative economy in Colombia? I've looked at, the strategies and policy that you put in place. Can you just talk to our audience a little bit about what are some of the specific things you're focusing on as you shape creative economy policy in Colombia?
Sure. It's actually a very interesting framework. Back in the book with current president of Colombia, Iván Duque, we came up with a framework we call the 7 I's, the 7 ideas. The first one is information, because you need information for informed policy making. You need to follow up the impact of policy. You also need to understand the economic and the non-financial key indicators of the sector in order to know what's the real situation of the ecosystem. Then you need institutions. That's the second I, because you need to make sure that people understand that cultural institutions are not just, public officials. It's also the third sector. It's also associations. It's also the academy that contributes with ideas and with following up and building up this institutional framework that allows a conversation and an implementation of policies. Then you have infrastructure. That's the level playing field mechanism. You need to invest in better theaters. You need to invest in better public spaces. You need to invest in better connectivity and access to the internet. You need to invest in libraries and communal cultural spaces, especially because, central areas sometimes tend to have very good infrastructure, but when you move to the periphery or to rural areas, you lose this density of infrastructure that allows people to share culture and to express their identities. Then you have the fourth I is industry, is how you articulate the value chain. Because, in culture and arts and creativity, you have the creation part, is where we put most of the attention, but we often forget that you need to produce those ideas. I mean, a great narrative has to become either a book, a play, a movie, and then it has to be distributed. It has to go through circulation channels that can be either a screen that is portable, but also can be a stage, or can be a library, or I mean, whatever you require. And that is how you connect with people and actually inspire the people and build up citizenship around creativities when you communicate it. So that's why industry is so important. Then we have integration. Integration, it works both ways, inwards and outwards. Inwards, because you often have areas of the country where there are incredible diversity, but it's disconnected from these industry stages, and you need to actually connect them to the main local markets. And other times you have amazing products with a global potential, and you need to connect that with international markets. So that integration is very important also for the protection of intellectual property and for the co-production, co-investment, co-creation between communities at long distances. Then you have inclusion. Inclusion for me is the most important because one of the main purposes of having cultural exchanges is to develop citizens, is to make people reflect on what's going on in the world. And culture provides you with the tools to engage with troubles collectively. I mean, how you face certain problems in inequality or after a crisis such as the pandemic of the COVID-19 or a big earthquake, a lot of that is defined in the cultural exchanges and behaviors. So when you create citizens that can engage, that can have a dialogue, and that can accept diversity, you have tolerance and you have tools to face challenges as a community. And that does not mean closing up yourselves. And it's actually about how you evolve and how you adapt constantly, but also how you create opportunities for the diversity that often is in sidelined communities, in disenfranchised communities, in order for them to come to the center stage and become opportunities for people to be recognized and to be included in development. And finally, you have inspiration, because this all starts, with a little girl that is full of talent, a little boy who is full of questions, and you need to provide them with models to follow or models to challenge. That's where education is so important, because it's when you actually provide through elementary education, the opportunity to develop your talents, to find out who you are. And by that, you have to provide them frameworks to follow, people that serve as an example because they have made it, but also they may come with the idea that they can be better or that does not adapt to them. So you have to provide them with the tools, the educational tools, so they can challenge things and keep this all moving on. This is actually like a positive feedback loop. It's the 7 eyes, they all feed each other. And I think that's why our approach has been so successful, because it's very integral and includes all the different angles of public policy for the creative economy.
Absolutely. I think the 7 eyes is a great framework. I definitely encourage our policymakers who are joining us for this session to consider the way that Colombia has framed their policy development around the 7 eyes, and indeed the Orange Economy, the book that Felipe mentioned that was produced by the Inter-American Development Bank. You can find out more about the 7 eyes there in the broad terms, but in Colombia's policy documents, you can find more about it in very specific and concrete terms. It's very imaginative, I think, and it's very different often than how policy is constructed here in the US, for sure. And I think people can learn a lot from it. I think another thing you mentioned that is very clear, has a lot of clarity in terms of policy, is the instruments you use. And I know that there's a simple way in a way that you talk about that, about incentives for investment and incentives for activity. Can you talk about how a lot of policy development in the creative economy is about offering incentives to stimulate the creative economy?
Well, when you do research and when you find out the actual relationships between the economy and the cultural activities that we have every day, even if they are not for profit, right? You usually find out what economists call a lack of incentives or a disarticulation among the different elements of the creative ecosystem. Because many or most cultural policies worldwide, that's true from Colombia to France and from the US to Australia or from China to South Africa, tend to focus exclusively or mostly around creation and sometimes also on production. But they tend to forget about the environment, the enabling factors such as infrastructure in like normal areas, or in the protection of intellectual property rights, or on the circulation and the education of audiences. So what happens here is that it's relatively easy to come up with the idea of grants for creators. That's very popular. It's easy to understand. It's easy to enact. But when you need investment, and I don't mean small amounts, but actually large amounts to develop infrastructures for an audiovisual industry, or to regenerate downtown or peripheral areas around culture, that's something you cannot do with public funds in a direct way. You need the private sector to get invested in investing in the communities. And that means you have to put economic incentives for them. So what we have been doing in Colombia is understanding how the markets behind culture work, so we can put our tax breaks in a way that motivate non-cultural actors to put their capital behind culture. And that is actually creating a very interesting new dynamic in the country. Just to give you an example, before the enactment of our audiovisual incentives for international productions in 2012, Colombia have had in 50 years 14 international productions in its territory with a very low value of investment. Then we create our first incentive in 2012. It started in 2013. Between 2013 and 2019, right before the pandemic, we had around 30 productions with a value that completely left behind whatever done before in the country. But we created an even better incentive right in the middle of the pandemic. About a year ago, we launched it. And in just 1 year, we have 34 productions with a value that is more than 3 or 4 times everything that was made before in Colombia together in the last 70 years, 60 years. So that's how you motivate people to invest in developing the infrastructure, in bringing the technologies, in bringing the opportunities, in transferring technologies. Because in order to be able to make in Colombia the productions we are making, which are productions at the level of Game of Thrones right now, you're going to see them in maybe 1 year, a half or 2 years when they are done after post-production. You need to form people as makeup artists. You need to develop people in managing lighting, sound, in improving the conditions of our production studios. And that is real development. And the government has no money to do something like that. And actually, we don't have experience in doing films. So that's when you have to put all your efforts into attracting the experts, the best people to do it for you. And for that, you have to make incentives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Felipe. I think the great thing about the way that you all approach the work and the way that you personally approach the work is that you look at it from such a holistic perspective and integrated perspective, and really like an industry and sector level perspective that I think a lot of people in our audience could learn a lot from as well. I'm going to shift into like something specific that we'll talk about for a bit. That's the focus of our conversation, as you know, and that's what we call in the US creative districts. But I know that in your policy, you call them Orange Development Areas, ADNs as the acronym. And I want you to start by just telling our audience what the orange economy is, and then let's move into a conversation around what orange development areas are.
Okay, well, orange economy is a term we came up with President Duque about 9 years ago, almost 10 now actually, when we met in the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington. We were trying to figure out how is it that great ideas and concepts such as the creative economy by John Hawkins, or the rise of the creative class by Richard Florida, and books about the value of culture in Mexico by Ernesto Piedras, and many analyses made by the World Intellectual Property Organization or UNESCO or UNCTAD. We were really confused. How come culture, being such a relevant element of development, is not present in the big debates about the future of Latin America, and in particularly in that moment in the recovery after the Great Recession? So one of our conclusions was a problem of marketing. And we realized that the environmental movement, had been very successful at labeling it as a green economy. That's marketing. So we start asking ourselves, okay, what would be the right label for culture? And we started, doing a little research, and we found out that culture and creativity and leadership and transformation are related in most cultures with the orange color. So we start speaking in key about our orange book. And in the process, we coined the term orange economy, which is pretty much the same definition as the creative economy with certain key elements, because we have evolved it at the moment with more technology than it was the initial case 20 years ago. But in essence, is a synonym of the creative economy, and it ends up becoming an umbrella term that allows different ways to see creative development from different perspectives. Actually, in the book, we don't commit with a specific definition. We provide certain elements, and we keep the debate open because we believe this can be really an umbrella term for everybody to adopt.
Wonderful. So thanks for the intro around the orange economy, and now orange development areas as part of your strategy, also known as ADNs. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that idea emerged and what an orange development area is?
Well, the creative districts, as you know, are or is a proven strategy for the transformation of communities. Of course, there's a debate that I guess we're going to have later on how they are followed up and how they are implemented. But the principle is proven to work. When you have a committed community, a committed leadership around preserving or highlighting elements of identity in the process of reinvigorating an area of a city, it works. And the thing is, Colombia, having several natural creative and cultural districts, they were not accompanied by any public policy. No benefits, no infrastructure expenditure with the purpose of the public sector to develop these areas. So noticing that, part of our strategy for Colombia was to bring a strategy for the whole country on creative and cultural districts. And we came up with the concept of orange development areas because ADN in Spanish stands for DNA. And the whole purpose of it was to create something to help to improve the genetic DNA of our cities and communities by providing them with incentives for investment in infrastructure, for the seed capital, for entrepreneurs, to concentrate the public offering for creatives so they can find out easier for the grants and for the support about the management of their talents, and also for them to start clustering together and start having a more serendipitous opportunities to create together and to evolve and to make money and to make better creations and more complex products.
Wonderful. So, a lot of people, I think especially here, although there are lots of states in the West and across the country that are setting up creative districts programs. And as you say, it's a proven strategy. For some people, they consider it to be an old-fashioned mechanism for supporting the creative economy. And you've begun to talk about why it was important and why you all have focused on that as at least one of the many strategies that you have for advancing the creative economy. I know in our pre-conversation, you talked a little bit about, in a sense, how creative districts facilitate chance encounters. So we'll start there and just describe more about what is the vision that you all have for creative districts and how is it really a contemporary 21st century state-of-the-art policy endeavor to support the creative economy?
Well, I think I will start by stating that yes, the idea is not new. But that idea is not new. It does not mean it's no longer relevant. Of course, if you already have functional creative districts, you might think is outdated. But the thing is, to make a creative district work, you just don't name it. You have to actually put in motion a whole strategy for the ecosystem to articulate and make it work. Now, a creative district is not something you put on a paper and you say this is a creative district. You have to actually, commit the community, the local authorities, the private sector, the social sectors, in order to work together. And that requires a constant effort. So probably the first thing is precisely about that, is understanding that, of course, some people just jump into the boat and say, I want to have a creative district, but they are not really committed. So when they enact a creative district and they don't follow up, and the community is not on board, well, it's easy to say or dismiss the idea. But then you have also the creative districts that are working, creative districts that have changed entire communities, that have created hundreds and thousands of lives changed around culture, and actually entire parts of a city that have been completely recovered for people. Areas that were industrial, areas that were, just coming down. You will find parts in central Detroit that have completely changed just because they embrace culture. You and I were witnesses of Glasgow and Edinburgh and Liverpool, and you are starting to watch it in Bogota and in Barranquilla and in Medellin, and hopefully in other cities in the country. Right now, we have 73 creative districts that have been created in the last 24 months in over 38 cities in Colombia. And they have big cities like Bogota with 12 creative districts, and you have small towns like Riohacha in one of the poorest parts of the country, which is actually when you can see people believing in the transformative power of culture. Now, is it to be seen how many of these 73 and maybe others are going to be created have the actual, commitment of communities, local authorities, and private investors in order to succeed? Let's say half. I think that's a great start, because when you have nothing and then you have 35, 40 great creative districts in a country like Colombia, you are creating actually factories of dreams, places where people can get together to let arts and culture become true, first and foremost, in order to express, but then to become real in terms of creating a stream of income that actually supports the people that are dreaming and are making arts and culture work. So I think that's the first thing you have to have into account. It's not about just a statement. The other thing is, if you don't have a general ecosystem in the country supporting the idea of a creative district, it's very difficult for them to strive. Because, as I said, something like the intellectual property protection is very important, and it's something that is, if it's not working in the country, if there's not a copyright office where you can protect your work, or if there are no grants for creation, or if there's no commitment in order to build infrastructure, if there are no incentives for investment in the creative sector, well, then cultural and creative districts can be empty. But if you have a committed, concerted effort in order to articulate different areas of government, different areas of the society, that's different. And the thing is, you don't do it for the sake of the cultural and creative district. You do it for the people that create, for the creators, for the artists. And it's not about just giving them money. It's about, in a way, changing their mindset in order for them to embrace opportunities and to realize that they can make a good living, that they can have high quality of life by doing what they do best, which is to use their talents to inspire people and transform communities.
Wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about alternative downtowns, because I know we talked about that a little bit, and you described for our audience how 73 creative districts have been created in the last 24 months, and 12 of those, I believe, are in Bogota. And you were describing to me before how they have created these alternative downtowns. Can you just share a little bit more about that idea for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's weird because most people call the central part of the cities downtowns, and it's actually that's just derived from New York, because downtown, uptown. But the reality is cities tend to have centers, they're old parts, and that's where a lot of infrastructure and heritage and the uses of communities are centered. And that is usually, very good for the pride of cities of citizens. I know people love their cities and they are in love with their downtowns. But it happens that our cities today are very large, because I don't know, century and a half ago, cities were 100,000, 200,000. Very few cities like London or New York growing at the time were really large. So central areas were really comfortable to concentrate certain infrastructures. But a city like Bogota, today with a bit over 8 million people, an extension of maybe 1,500 to 2,000 square kilometers. I mean, not everybody can go to downtown every day to enjoy culture. So you have to have alternative downtown areas. And creative districts work for that pretty well, because you create communities and identities that respond better to the local traditions and to the local dynamics. But this is also necessary because big cities tend to have a problem with identifying themselves with certain values or with certain elements of history, precisely because big cities attract a lot of migrants from inside the country, from outside the country. In Colombia, we have Bogota with people from the northern coast, from the Pacific Rim, from the plains in the eastern part, but also we have close to 500,000 Venezuelans, and we have maybe a 250,000 of other citizens from other countries in the city. So you need to start creating spaces for identity, for cultural expression, to create the civic values that allow these communities to strive, but also to start attracting other developments that allow also to use better infrastructure. I mean, when people find these alternative downtowns, they also stop, everybody going to downtown for work. Everybody stops also going downtown to find entertainment and many other things. And that also unclog city centers and the main arteries of the city. So it's actually even good for environment. So that's a very important concept we have here, and we have been trying to put together.
Absolutely. For some folks in our audience, they're very aware of the way that sometimes cities are prioritized within creative economy strategies, and in a lot of these discussions, and some people are very aware of the needs within our suburban and even rural communities. Can you describe a little bit about how the creative districts that you're formulating in Colombia may serve, communities that are not necessarily highly urbanized? I know you've touched on this a little bit so far, but do you want to say anything else about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, when you have, sprawling cities in many places in the world, in the case of certain American cities, you have central areas, the main city, and a suburban area surrounding it. In the case of countries like Colombia, you have something similar in a way, but not maybe as sprawling, but the principle is exactly the same. When you create alternative downtowns closer to the communities, closer to the values and the cultural and creative expressions, that allows communities to feel again enfranchised, to be represented in their entertainment opportunities and offerings around them. But also, it becomes an opportunity to attract the movement of people from other areas to visit you. Because, how often when somebody lives somewhere in a suburb, you say, hey, where we should meet? Because around here, there's nothing to do. While when you create cultural opportunities nearby, what you do is you create the opportunity for you to share with pride that you belong to a community that can be a suburban area of a city like Denver, for instance, or a city like Bogota or Medellin. So it's not only about going there. One area that is very surprising for us, the development is having, is actually becoming an orange development area in Medellin. It's Comuna 13. Comuna 13 is infamous because of the violence that was experimented in that area. But today, you have a graffiti district there with amazing coming up cuisine. They are starting to share their gastronomy and winning local contests. They have also been creating, they are transforming their clothing and their fashion identity into trends that create a new perception of the community. It generates a new pride. So this area that was full of violence just 10, 15 years ago, today is probably the most touristic area of Medellin, and is also a money-making area for the communities, which is actually paying for schools and universities and transformation of whole families that had no opportunity before. So these new centralities apply both for peripheral parts of big cities that are concentrated, but also for the suburban areas, allowing for communities to find, new ways to integrate and to strengthen their civic values.
Incredible. Thank you, Felipe. So we're going to move into some other parts of this conversation. Looking like, I guess, in a broader lens, not just about creative districts. So I think it's such a great strategy for getting buy-in from different stakeholders and really to have impact on the ground and not have policymaking be too high level. I know the creative economy can be pretty nebulous to a lot of policymakers. And I know that you've experienced this in the different roles that you've had. How have you overcome that in your work? How can we, as those who are advocating on behalf of the creative economy, have policymakers understand more about what we're talking about and what the opportunities and possibilities are?
Well, definitely is not an easy conversation. Policymakers tend to be concentrated on goods and services, and that's what they understand, because it's easy to frame, it's easy to act on it. In a way, it happens that what we were speaking earlier, that it's very, when an easy approach is available, you just dismiss everything else. If it's easy just to give grants, you give grants and you say you are doing cultural work, but you forget about the whole of the ecosystem. And what happens is that today you have an economy in a country like the United States where only 1.3% of your workforce is devoted to agriculture, and another less than 10% is devoted to manufacturing. So close to 90% is in services. But when you get into services, you will find that maybe a seventh or maybe a sixth of it is financial. And then there are other services, transportation, certain utilities, and so on. But then you have like maybe 15% of your whole economy is about experiences. And experiences are not common goods and services. They are based on identity, on feelings, on emotions, on you actually wanting to remember what you got. I mean, when you buy a soda, you just drink it. Or when you pay for the change of a tire, you just go away. But when you go to a Cirque du Soleil presentation, you want to remember what you felt while you were there. And for policymakers, it's very difficult to put their heads around feelings because they are complex. Because you can describe a financial service in a relatively simple way. You can describe a good in a relatively simple way. But to describe experiences, emotions, identity in terms of policy is very hard because it's constantly changing. Justice services are much more difficult to understand and follow up than goods. Emotions, experiences are even harder. So that's the challenge. For me, it's been very, very fortunate that I found my partner in President Ivan Duque in order to have these conversations and to put together ideas and to publishing a book because, well, he was also not only a policymaker, he was also a politician. And, well, having, your co-author as president of a country really, really, props up your ideas and gives you the opportunity to share. Now, inside the government, it's been also a challenge, even having support to explain willing partners how to do their work. And in many ways, you don't know how to help them in doing their work beyond sharing your ideas and trying to articulate conversations. Because at the end, policy making is a conversation endeavor. It's an effort of exchanging ideas and finding out solutions for problems. And the first thing you have to do there, and the most difficult thing, is to frame up the challenge, to define what you want to do, why you are doing it. And the thing is one thing is to have a general framework for the creative economy. Another thing is to sit down at the level of the Ministry of Trade and try to see how that translates into international treaties, how that translates in terms of managing incentives for international investors, how that translates in order to provide juridical stability to investments and to companies. And then the same applies for your development of communications infrastructure, your connectivity, how you translate that to that, how you translate that into a better skill set proposal for your agencies that are in charge of skills, working skills development, how you translate that into the curricula for universities. I mean, it's a very wide challenge, but when you have the opportunity, what we have in Colombia is a national council for the orange economy that was created by law, which has 7 ministries: the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Trade, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of ICTs, the Ministry of Culture, which presides the whole thing. And we also have here the Copyright Office. We have our Skills Development Agency. We have our National Planning Department, which is like another ministry. We have also a financial entity from the government. So we have here an integral group of people with a mandate to articulate. So check that. I mean, when you are speaking about developing policy for culture, one thing is how you develop the artist individually, but where the artist is going to work is much more complex than just having a theater for the presentation. It's also about having education from kindergarten, elementary, secondary, and tertiary. It's also having connectivity. It's also having international trade treaties that understand how these services work. It's also understanding how labor law applies, because when you have a creative sector, what you have is a sector that is based on projects, not on employment, and that changes how the rights of a worker need to be understood. Because if you insist the same level of regularity in terms of payment and in social services from somebody trying to invest in a play, you have a problem, because you have different objectives as an artist or as an investor when you are developing the play than when you are presenting the play. And then you have off times, and then sometimes you have to close up the theater for remodelation, for renovations. I mean, you need to understand the dynamics, and for that you need to go well beyond just the cultural institutions. And I think that's the big change here, and that has been the biggest challenge, and that's probably the biggest contribution if this is going to remain in the country, to create this transversality of the understanding of policy making for culture that is not just propping up some artists. That is very important. But if you stop there, you are going to keep having them in need of other solutions that require more money but are not in the hands of the cultural authorities.
Understood. we talked a little bit about how the people who typically have shaped um, cultural policy and creative economy policy for those spaces in which that even exists. You've talked about this model and the council that you all established that is basically like an interdepartmental council within government. But as we know, a lot of times who's responsible for formulating policy for the creative economy and formulating cultural policy is people who come from the arts and cultural sector and leadership positions there. So can you talk about like what would you recommend to people like that in terms of their approach as they move forward and try to serve more than just the artists and cultural institutions as you just described it?
Well, I guess the first thing, and probably the most important, is to invite them to understand that whether they like it or not, cultural and artistic activities are economic artistics as well, activities as well. And I say this because, as you know, there's often a lot of resistance from cultural and creative types acknowledging themselves as commercial. I think there's a gap of information to fill there, and is that something can be traded, that something can be shared for a fee or something, does not diminishes its symbolic value. It does not undermines what it represents for a community, because you can share goods and services and experiences, whether through market-based mechanisms, such as, you produce a song and you can just sell it or sell its access or its reproduction through a platform. But you can also have, an access-free concert in the main plaza of a city that is a non-market-based way to develop, to enjoy arts and culture. You may have free access museums, but they are not for free. Somebody's paying for them, whether by the sponsorship of private sector or by the use of public money, which is what we all pay through either through taxes or through the income generated by the royalties of oil or minerals or other endeavors the government used to make money. So in any way, there's always, you always have to pay for culture. So when policymakers coming from the cultural sector understand that reality, and that does not make culture or arts less, but that understanding, just like it's so difficult for policymakers in economic development to understand emotions and experiences, for creative types it's very difficult to understand economic dynamics. So it's to try to put aside the antipathy for it and try to understand it so they can take better advantage of the opportunities of understanding economic dynamics in order to improve the quality and the resources of arts and cultural expressions, because that's important. And the other thing is to understand, when you realize that, you start finding out that a lot of what you need is way beyond your level of understanding or your level of control. Because if you realize that in order to have a great cultural infrastructure, you need great knowledge of technologies and coverage of connectivity and better labor laws and better training for technical activities that are not artistic but are related in order to provide quality for the presentations and the illumination of the theater and the illumination of different, temporary stages, like in a park or something. I mean, when you understand the complexity of the cultural ecosystem, then you can concentrate on the creative policy part, the artistic promotion policy part, but also you understand that you need to work with others in order to enhance the whole ecosystem where creatives, where the talented people have to work. Because if you only put the grants for the creation, you are leaving everything else aside, and that is going to keep on piling up difficulties and pressures that cannot be fulfilled through grants.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that that's definitely a space that we're currently in the US, is the evolution of cultural policy and creative economy policy to, in a lot of ways, be more sophisticated. A lot of our audience who work in that space or in those spaces will be confronting having an expanded constituency base that is not just artists and cultural institutions, but now much more encompasses creative businesses as a result of relief and recovery funding. So what you're talking about is very topical at the moment. And I hope that colleagues looking in and participating in this session will learn more about the policy environment in Colombia for creative economy and the strategies that you and your colleagues have put in place. I want to turn our attention, as we're wrapping up the session, to something that we talked about in our prep conversation around it's okay to disagree. And you've already set up some of these dynamics about how policymakers don't always understand the experience economy. For those in our audience who have not heard that term, something to definitely look at. Is definitely thought-provoking. So policymakers may not understand the experience economy and the emotion and identity that is associated with experiences. And indeed, people in the cultural sector may not always understand or even have affinity for any kind of conversation around economic dynamics. There are politics at work in all of this. And I know for our stakeholders, there's a range of political philosophy and ideas. But I would say many people would say that the arts and cultural sector tends to be more progressive and liberal in terms of the political spectrum. And that leads to some of the antipathy for economics in the way that you described. What would you say to our audience about how we can come together, perhaps across those kinds of ideological divides, and shape creative economy policies that make sense given the factors that you have elaborated so far?
Well, I think the main distinction you have to make is between what is ideological and what is the political purpose. Because, I mean, if the ideology is to deny the existence of a market or the economic relationship between art and culture, well, that's a non-starter. But if your worry is how to provide equal opportunities, how to be more inclusive, how to provide for independence for the artists and creators in order to express themselves, then we have a conversation that is very important. So I believe that when you strengthen the cultural, artistic, and creative ecosystem by putting together all these pieces, what you're actually giving artists and creators is a lot of independence. So they can create without having to take into account political positions, whether from the left or from the right. They can criticize more openly, precisely because the economic independence they gain by understanding the cultural and the economic dynamics behind culture is precisely a way to unshackle yourself from, let me call it in a very probably unpopular way, the shackles of grants. When you can make money by understanding the dynamics of new platforms, then you don't have to please any kind of terms of reference for a grant. You can start expressing yourself in different ways. For sure, that's going to change your understanding. But if you have developed an audience,
I think we lost Felipe for a moment. Let's see what happens. All right, while we are waiting to see if Felipe is able to reconnect, I'd encourage folks to pose any questions that you have based on the conversation you've heard so far in the chat. All right, so I fear Felipe's phone died since he was joining us by his phone, but we've sent him a message and hopefully he'll be able to rejoin our conversation in a second. In the meantime, as we have to do from time to time, we will pivot. So I'm going to invite Randy to jump on and we can continue being in conversation together. And I will do my best to answer some of the questions.
I'm here.
Oh, you're back.
I'm
Cool.
back. I don't know why I got kicked out, but I'm here. I'm back.
Awesome.
So I think I was just finishing actually explaining that that when you gain economic independence, you actually are freer to speak out your mind. You have to please even less people. When you diversify your streams of income from platforms, grants, and different mechanisms, you earn an independence that is, I believe, is very good for innovation and creative expression and diversity.
Yep. Thank you for offering that. I think that it's important for us to understand our values and our perspectives and our points of view as well. But I do think it's important for in our sector and in our field for us to be capable of understanding the differences in perspective that exist. And indeed, that those differences in perspective give rise to different options about how we can do similar work to support creative people, creative workers, and how we can support our communities and societies more broadly. So I definitely appreciate you being willing to talk about some of these things about ideology. I know that we talked about before that there's a way in which sometimes people can demonize business or the private sector, especially in this environment. And there are a lot of justified criticisms, certainly of the business community and things like that. But I think you've been talking about, since the beginning of our conversation, the potential that arises from having communities and the public sector and the private sector work in partnership. And certainly in creative economy policymaking and creative economy development, particularly with creative districts. So I think some questions have come in from our audience. And so I will pose some of them. One of them coming from Terry Skillman: how do you get policymakers to budge and to shift their paradigm?
With a lot of patience. I mean, I remember there was I think it was from Bill Clinton several years ago, that you have to repeat. And when you are getting tired of repeating, they will be starting to understand. So you have to be very persistent. Of course, that means also constantly adapting and learning, because as they tend to be difficult, sometimes you are also difficult. And actually getting to understand each other's needs is what bridges the gap and allows you to have an enriching and transformative conversation with policymakers. It's persistence, but also understanding them and adapting your speech, probably changing your language. Maybe not, of course, not your objective, but understanding that they sometimes need different wording in order to accept your proposals.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm gonna try to find the question here but I'll just read it out. I may have missed this when I had to step away just now, but in Colombia, are there now, or could there be in the future, policies regarding institutional standards of education and providing protections for students who are pursuing formal training in the creative field to ensure the quality of their education gives them the proper tools to consciously participate in the creative economy as artists and or entrepreneurs?
Well, yes, I mean, that's the objective right now. I mean, we have been investing heavily in Colombia. We have the elementary and secondary schools. About 3/4 of it is really just part-time. They only go for the morning session or for the afternoon session. But we have been moving and accelerating to have a full day of school in the country. And part of making it full school is making the classes for arts and cultural activities more available, precisely to give school children. I mean, you cannot ensure for certain for everybody, but you can make it as widely available as possible for them to find out their talents. Then in the process, to have a better quality training and better quality of opportunities, we have something we call the Sacúdete. Sacúdete is another acronym for Salud, which is health, culture, technology, and entrepreneurship. And the idea here is for young people to be closer to the tools they need to develop their talents so they can prepare better if they want to make a living out of their talents, whether in sports or in culture. But also, we have expanded greatly the skills development agency offer on creative and creative related skills. So it's not only about the artist, it's also about the technicians that make sound function, that make lights function, but also the hospitality workers that need to understand how to guide a tourist where to go and have a good time, and where are the crafts markets, and so on. So it has to be integral. We are working there, and we are also doing something that for us at least is revolutionary. In Colombia, the education system is pretty much obsessed with tertiary education being on the professional level. So technical levels tend to be dismissed by many Colombians, but worst, practices are also often forgotten. And actually our system currently is not recognizing like craft mastering as a profession. So we are changing that and adapting the system so your experience of 20 years performing an art or a craft of certain kind can be recognized as a profession. And that will allow us not only to give you the pride of being a professional in it, also it finally opens up the opportunity for the government or whoever wants, any educational agency, to hire you as a teacher to pass on your knowledge and experience. Because today it's very difficult for me to go for a 60-year-old master of certain activity or certain craft that is maybe the last, person to know that specific way of knitting certain fiber. And it's about, 60, 70 years old, and I cannot hire them to teach to kids, and I cannot give him or the apprentices the pride of having, the knowledge of something that is important. In Japan, these people are known as national treasures. These crafts masters are national treasures in Japan, and they actually have a pension by the government, and their knowledge is protected by the law. We are trying to replicate that in Colombia in order to acknowledge about 3,000 craft knowledges that are not currently recognized in the education system as part of giving more access. But this is a work in progress. This is not fully done. We are pushing in the legislative law for that, actually 2 laws, one of the craftsmanship recognition and another one on craft makers, craft masters.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're about to wrap up, but I do want to offer you the opportunity, Felipe, to offer any final thoughts, recommendations, insights, encouragements to our audience before we wrap up.
Well, I think from my experience and my process around the creative economy, coming up with the orange economy umbrella concept, I think that the most important thing is to understand this should not be an ideological battlefield. This should be actually a conversation scenario, because cultural public policy is too important for a lot of people and for the future of our communities to be left to politicians. This is something that we have to have debates, we have to disagree, so we can find the actual solutions. It's something that should be away from left and right politics and to actually become a common purpose, understanding how culture really works, so we can actually take advantage of its full potential to create the opportunities of the 21st century. We are in the midst of a major shift in the economy and the society, and culture has to be a key player for that. And that's not an ideological thing. It's actually a reality we have to acknowledge and take responsibility in helping communities adapt. And culture is not only for the mindset of how you adapt to these changes, it's also a great space for creating opportunities in this economic and social transformation.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Anything we didn't get to, I'll do my best to address in the chat. Thank you so much, Felipe. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for all of your work supporting the creative economy in Colombia and globally.
Thank you, David, for having me here, for the invitation to this amazing conference and summit. And I hope I leave you with a lot of questions and with a lot of inspiration to keep finding answers for policymaking in the Western states.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care, Felipe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.